So with your approval and cooperation, let's welcome Janet Carter. Thank you.
I think just to be absolutely clear, we're being taped. Like a storyteller needs a CD. That's the truth of the matter. So any comments you have to make afterwards will not be on that, unless you really want them to be. I called this about families across the generations, and they're from very different places. I leave it to you to make any connections or lack thereof. The first one comes from our part of the world, actually, the Hudson Valley. Very different time, though. In about 1720, the authorities had a problem. You see, the Dutch settlers had been moving up from New York. They hit Saugerties about 1677 and continued on up the West Bank. The English were coming in from the Connecticut River area. There were incursions between the two and fears of something worse. The authorities hit upon a scheme. They encouraged Quakers to settle on the East Bank, a sort of pacifist buffer zone. It worked for a time. Friends were respected. They were known to be peaceable, although some of their customs were a little odd, like offering the hand to anyone, regardless of his station. Time passed. Now we're in the 1770s. 1777 to be exact. What we will know in our history books as the Battle of Saratoga had not yet taken place, but the frontier was incendiary. People you had trusted were now rebels or Tories. You were a patriot or a loyalist. And the word came now from the authorities to those scattered settlements up the Hudson, come south. South meant south of Albany. We cannot guarantee your safety. You must come. The Quakers in Easton meeting met in their unfinished meeting house, discussed the proclamation, and sent back their answer. We are the enemies of no man who passes here. We will stay. The children, of course, knew what was going on. Benjamin, son of the clerk of the meeting, Zebediah and Rebecca Hoxie, said to his sister, "Thee and me and all of us, we're all called Bostonaki." He liked to say the word. The older boys had told him it meant accursed Bostonians. Now, at this time, 30 miles to the south, a man named Richard Nesbitt had a leading that he should go north and worship with the friends at Easton. But it was 30 miles, and he put it aside. Leadings take seasoning. But it came again. So he made his preparations and started north. In the meanwhile, another proclamation, more urgent this time, had come from the colonial authorities. We cannot guarantee your safety. Come south. They could see horses and wagons moving on the other side of the river, going south. Benjamin came and listened to where the adults were. He wished they would go south. Maybe Father would put them on a boat and they'd go all the way downriver to New York City. He'd always wanted to see New York City. Rebecca caught his expression out of the corner of her eye. Benjamin, thee knows we must stay. We must finish our meeting house. Thee has heard me told thy father 100 times. We must have the windows and doors in before snow blows. Benjamin, he heard the We mustn't frighten the children, tone in her voice. But he went and leaned against her, as though he was much younger than 9. And he felt her arm tighten on his shoulder very hard. They went to meeting. A stranger came. Benjamin watched him. He went up and sat on the facing bench with Father. Now, this meeting not only had no windows and doors, but the logs had not been chucked yet. You could see through them. The children remembered that the meeting before, a bird had flown in one opening and right out the other. They wished it would happen again. Bertha was already asleep on their mother's lap, but Benjamin knew he was too old for that. He watched. And the stranger did rise. He said that he had come to applaud them, their gallantry in staying here. And he said, "But how are the children of light to be protected?" Well, I will speak to you in the words of the psalmist. He shall cover thee with his feathers, and you will find refuge. And you will not fear the terror of the night, or the arrow that flies by day. And he sat down. Benjamin knew he wasn't to wiggle, but that was strange. The bushes outside had moved, and there was no breeze in here. And then, although he knew he shouldn't in worship, he turned, and there was a man where the door should be. And there was a heavy smell, animal smell in the room. And he remembered that the war paint, that white and red paint, was made from bear grease. And the man stood so silently, and the arrow and bow in his hand were as if they were a part of his body. And Benjamin knew that the scream in his head was really just in his head, and that the room was silent, and that his mother sat in worship. And then the man, whose head was shaven except for one strip down the middle with the feathers in it, he made a gesture just ever so slight with his hands, and there were 4 more standing across the back of the room. And then they sat down. They put their bow against the back wall and they sat down. And then his father took the hand of Richard Nesbitt next to him, breaking meeting, and then he stood up and he walked towards the Akwesasne with his hand out. And Benjamin's father looked at him, and with just a little bit of a smile, and Benjamin knew. They went, all of them, the Akwesasne and the friends, to Benjamin's house, as they always did when there were visitors at meeting, and he and Bertha handed out the bread and cheese. And that tall man looked down at Benjamin and said, "Wolami." Benjamin had said it to himself so he would never forget. "Well, not me." Because he understood it meant thank you. Richard Nesbitt, who knew French, he had come from Scotland through Canada. And he discovered the Aquasage, they spoke some French, they had had many allies over the years. Oh yes, said the Indian, yes, we would have killed the people in that structure, but there were no weapons, so there was no need. Very matter of fact he was. Then he told Richard Nesbitt that he wanted everyone to go back to the meeting house. And he took a white feather from his headdress and he put it up above where the door should be, and he said that he would like it fastened there because they should understand that all our people, he said, will know this is a place of peace. You will not be bothered. And so it was. Through the remaining years of the war, that village stood unmolested. And Benjamin? Well, he never did get to New York City, but he didn't mind. The next one is titled From Georgetown to Athens, 1925. My mother told me that when she first walked out with my father in the streets of New York, people would turn their head to look at him. He was so handsome. I think she always was a little surprised that he chose her. They were married in the living room of a sister of hers in Garden City, Long Island. Well, it wasn't too surprising. Her in-laws were not present. They lived in Texas, Georgetown. Reverend and Mrs. Carter had retired there after his long service to the Methodist Church South abroad. It was true that in the years to come, Isabel figured out that none of her husband's siblings were ever married in the presence of Reverend and Mrs. Carter. In fact, she told me once that she always knew if one of the girls brought someone home, the romance ended precipitously. But she didn't know that and had no real reason to feel concerned. They went to Georgetown, and the pattern was soon established that the Reverend Carter would go out first thing in the morning and pick figs from his tree to share with his daughter-in-law because she enjoyed them so much. The two of them agreed together that they would never put milk on figs, as some people do. He also allowed the Reverend Carter made reference to his memoirs, assuming clearly that she had read them. Isabel was a quick on the uptake, and she said, well, we haven't unpacked entirely, but perhaps you have a volume of it here. I would so like to see it. Well, he did. She read. It was fascinating, his memoirs. Reverend Carter had been 12 years old during the war between the states and had indeed guarded Yankees. But the thing that really struck her, quietly making notes as it was, Isabel, was when he spoke of his wife and the first time he saw her. Cornelia, known to her many friends as Dee Dee. He spoke of how her graceful carriage and her sweet smile enthralled him. And that 7 years later, they were married and had gone through life together. Isabel thought, 7 years? Well, the visit was broken because a call came from New York City. There was a job interview for Hugh. He had to get back immediately. Isabel rose to the occasion. She offered to drive Mrs. Carter home to Athens, Tennessee for a visit. She had picked up on the point that Athens was always home. It is some 800 miles from Georgetown, Texas, to Athens, Tennessee. They set out. They drove up towards Houston and then up along a road that not too long before had been the cattle run, where cattlemen in Texas sent literally thousands of animals up to the north, much to the umbrage of the farmers of the area that put a stop to the practice by means of the new invention of barbed wire. In any event, that was the road. And then over into Louisiana, and of course a piece of Mississippi. Now, have you driven in an antique car? I mean, a really antique car? The ones with the runners and the clutch that you have to fight. I have seen one in which there is a place to put the buggy whip for some reason. But most important, it has non-inflatable tires. You have to really look for service stations because you may need them. There were not that many women driving around Mississippi in 1925. My mother, who was never a flamboyant dresser, did have red hair, and it was bobbed. A crease would appear in the brow of the serviceman as he came to the car and saw my mother. But it would always clear. His face would relax as soon as he saw Mrs. Carter. There could be no impropriety in the presence of Mrs. Carter. And indeed, when they were ready to leave, and she said, "May the Lord bless you and keep you," you could be sure that he would. As time went by, my mother, who had not been studying anthropology up there in New York for nothing, learned a great deal that she put to good advantage. Oh, church ownership, pyramid status, naming rituals, deference patterns. But as they approached Athens, her manner changed. She became almost subdued. As we come into town, we'll pass the Davis place. John Lewis and I were friends all our lives. Oh, it was fun to be one of the Keith girls. There were church socials and a harvest celebration. And then he went up to north. It was, the railroad said, a 3-month training program. He met and married a woman from Cincinnati. Well, I had my church work, and I helped Mama, and my friends were getting married. Oh, my sister Kate had a beautiful wedding. Married up to Virginia, one of the Vaughn boys. And then I went down on my knees and I prayed. And I prayed to the Lord, and I said, I want some adventure in my life. I want to get out of Athens. Well, my prayers were answered. They can be, you know. I married the Reverend Carter, and I went with him to do the Lord's work. 2 of my children born in Mexico, one buried there. Oh, he was well respected. He went to England. I stayed in Cuba with the children, and I've never regretted it. Oh, Isabel, there's the house. We're there. Yeah, you go right in here, dear. Yeah, under those sycamores. See, there's the pillar I told you about. Yeah, there were Yankee bullets right in there, and Papa said he'd never repair that. Oh, Isabel, you are a blessed listener. Now, dear, we won't talk about the things that have come up. I mean, it might upset people. Isabel, of course, knew she was being told to keep a secret from her new husband, and she readily agreed. So the two of them, they went up the steps arm in arm, and all the Keiths who came to meet her, they knew at once. Mrs. Carter so approved of her new daughter-in-law that they never even mentioned that Isabel had been born in Michigan. It's the first time I ever told a story about my mother. You tell stories about relatives before you knew them, I discover, when they're sort of another person or something. Oh, this one. Long ago and far away, on the great steppes of Central Asia, there lived a girl named Ho Lang. This is her story. Her people were nomads. They moved with the herds. They were riders, and they were tough and strong. Hoyland had 3 sisters, but she knew she was her father's favorite. She'd heard the men. They came in from herding. They'd squat around the fire and talk. And there was one. He always wanted to talk about the fact that it was a great tragedy when a man, a leader, a fine herder, came to the prime of his life and had no sons. This was a cause for mourning. Oh, Lang's father, he pretended not to hear. But after a time, he spit in the fire and allowed as how his Ho Lang had ridden when she was 2 and could stand upright on a galloping steed before her 5th summer. He did not recall any of the other children performing those tasks so young. It was true. She was strong. She was a rider. She could match any man, and she grew up beautiful. So there was, of course, discussion about whom she should marry. It was a custom that if a man wanted a wife from another clan, he would go present himself to the elders and indenture himself for 2 years' hard labor to earn a wife. Thus it was that from out of the west one day came Chiladu of the laughing eyes. He rode his roan mare so well you saw it at once. So that night, when the family was alone in their tent, Ho Lang's father, he looked at her and he said, "So, Ho Lang, shall we give this one a chance?" And her mother went, "Tch, you don't ask a girl about such important matters." But Ho Lang, she looked back at her father and she gave a little smile, and it was decided. As time passed, the men acknowledged that he was a strong one. Chiladu declared that he would not have his wife ride like a commoner. He would build her a cart and she would be drawn. It was black with red wheels. Oh, Ho Lang's sisters were beginning to cry a little behind their hands because she was going so far away. But Ho Lang, she could not feel sad. Her father had traded three good milk cows for an ermine robe that she was to take as her bridal present to her new family. The day came, the ceremony, they set out, they stepped under the stars, they traveled for many, many days. And after a bit then, Chiladu said to Ho Lang, When we come to the Onan River, we will turn south, and then it will only be 2 or 3 more days till we meet up with my people. They did not know that they were being watched. Chilidu, up on the bluff, he saw Ho Lang, and he saw the ermine. For, you see, there was another way to gain a wife. And they came down now, 3 of them, thundering down around the cart. Chilidu paused not an instant. He reared his horse and he moved west as a diversion, trying to get them to follow him away from her at work. They left. And as suddenly as the sound, now it was silent. And she was alone. And she knew the next. She knew 2 could not stand against 3, not in an unknown country. For the Mongol, the first obligation is survival. And she knew that if she stayed, Chilidu could get away. He came back, he circled back as she knew he would, and she looked at him and said, "Go." And he paused for just an instant, and he acquiesced, and he started to turn, and she flipped off her blouse, and she put it next to his face, so that the smell of her body was next to him as he moved away from her. And he turned his head so many times to look back that his black braids were flying like birds around his head. And she waited until she was absolutely sure he was out of hearing, and then she let loose a cry of anguish and anger that would have lifted the mountain. And so it was that she became Usugi's wife. And not the first wife either. There was one already and children. The tribe he took her to her, they felt like scavengers, she thought. They're not herdsmen at all. They roam the mountain, they prey on people, and the men, they don't even braid their hair, it hangs down around their faces. But she would survive. When her first child was born, Usugi was on a raid. She brought the baby forth alone, cut the cord, cleaned the nostrils. She knew to do these things. But then as she held him, she saw that his tiny fist was clasped very tight, and she lifted the fingers slowly, one by one. There, in the baby's hand, was the black, dark blood clot. And she suddenly felt like an ignorant girl. What did it mean? Was it for good or evil? And she saw the baby staring at her. And she looked back. And she said, "We'll make it for good." The father gets to name the baby. So he came back, called it Tuchunzin. Now no one knew, of course, that Temujin was to become the Genghis Khan, the universal ruler. Now Hollywood has made of him a slit-eyed devil, but Hollywood was wrong. But a great deal was to happen before that. One day, Usugi did not come back. Now, it was the custom when this happened that a brother would take the widow and children. But in this case, Usugi's brothers looked at the ground. There were 7 mouths involved, and one of them, that one. So they decided to leave them. The 2 wives, the 5 children. The clan gathered itself, packed its bag, began to move out. An old man was the only one who objected. He came and looked at the Khan and he said, "It is winter coming. You cannot leave your own." And the Khan, without changing his expression, he took his spear, hit the old man in the chest, and let him fall. Holang watched, and now she moved to the front. She did not cry, she did not beg, she did not speak of her children. She said, "You do not follow your own rules, you will not survive." They could not meet her eyes. The people moved back. But the victory was short. During the night, they snuck away, leaving. Winter coming. No cattle, no horse. Holang looked at Temujin. They didn't need to tell each other they were going to survive. Holang pulled up her skirts, went down into the icy Onan River, lifted the rocks, and found those tiny little creatures living under that. Temujin, he took the other children and went into the forest where he could find a fallen tree, and digging down among the roots could find the grubs that they ate, and they survived. They piled onto each other at night, the 7 bodies, to give a little warmth, and they survived. There's something about this young man. He was now adopted, finally, by a neighboring tribe, and he began to show his skills. When he went out, leading a group on a raid, he said, "Let us agree together. If one man does not come back, his widow and family will get his share." It had never been done before. They became fiercely loyal to this young man. There were many things that he did. He spoke of something called the law, that they should all know and share. Oh, it had existed, they had it somewhere, but he made it real. He also, you have heard this before, he forbade torture of prisoners because he said it was ineffective. Finally, the time came when he had to decide, did he aspire to be the Khan? Now, it was very democratic in a way. When a man made this decision, he called a kulatai, a gathering, a council. And if you wanted to follow him, you came. That was how it was decided. The morning that it had been called, Temujin stood alone, and Holang, not too far away. First nothing, and then gradually, men came with their families, with their horses, and more, and they filled the space in front of Temujin. And he said to them, "I will lead you. We will make our people safe. But one thing I must require of you. From now on, we will not steal our women. We will earn them. We will earn wives like men." And Holang held her throat, this woman of extraordinary self-control. She had never known how much he knew of her. Now came the time of the great explosion. Temujin trained his soldiers, his followers, with their able, tough little Asian horses to do extraordinary things. they were not above deception. They were near the Silk Road, which is actually several different roads, and so people were used to seeing merchants. He made his war party travel between wagons, so they looked as if that's what they were until they were quite close. He also would go to a village and liberate the people, and they would flee to the next town, so tension built. And he became the Genghis Khan, the great, great ruler. Now, there had been world conquerors before this. Julius Caesar, Alexander. None of them achieved what he did. Universal law, the counterpart of trade zones, and an empire that you would take a year to transfer. And you know, another thing about Genghis Khan, he died in his bed as an old man, surrounded by people fiercely loyal to him. And I think it has something to do with his mother. Do you have any question or thought about the stories?